Hello, welcome back to our software development training. Today we are on lesson 4, HTML attribute and property. My name is Jojo Encho. Alright, in today's lesson, we are looking at what is an HTML attribute. And then we will take the star attribute and look into it. We will then move on to look at the ID, name, and class attributes as well. And then we will also look at the href, src, and alt attributes. And finally, we will look at the HTML DOM and property. As usual, we will have some time for questions and other comments. If you are ready, let's begin our lesson today. If you have been following the lesson so far, especially from our previous lesson, I made mention of HTML attributes severally. For instance, when we look at the link element, I made mention of the type attribute where we specified the type of link. I also made mention of the relationship or rel attribute, and then I mentioned of the hre attribute. So what is an HTML attribute? Briefly, we can say that an HTML attribute is a special decoration that provides additional information about an element. That is to say that an attribute gives extra information or meaning to the element. For example, the type attribute we added to the link gives its meaning that this is a type of text and it must be read as CSS. Always know that we place attributes in the beginning or opening tag of an element. So to place an attribute just after the name of the element in the beginning tag, we place all attribute there before the right angle of the same opening tag. So a kind of inside the opening tag after the name. Know that an element can have multiples of attributes. Okay, so let's enter our coding arena to see how attributes are and the extra information they provide on element. Okay, so welcome to the coding studio or IDE. From our previous lesson, we added a link to our HTML document. Now the link has extra data attached to it. It is a kind of decoration or extra information we are adding to the element. This is what we refer to as attribute. Ideally or usually, an element is an opening tag, a closing tag with some content within. However, we can add some decoration to that element to make it more meaningful or to provide extra information. This is what we often do to lay emphasis on the element. Okay, so let's proceed with our lesson. We will come back for more explanation examples of attribute. Okay, so that was the attribute we had on the link elements as we created from our previous lesson. As you notice from the coding arena, an attribute comes in a name value pair. That is, a name equals, then you open the double quotes and the value comes within the quote. Name equals double quote, then value in between the double quote. Let's have a look once more. Okay, so as you can see, the attribute is of the form attribute name equals then attribute value in between a double quote. Name of attribute is equal to the value of attribute in between a double quote. Mind you can also use a single quote. It all does the same job. However, the only thing you need to know is that most attributes are predefined special HTML keywords. Attributes are predefined special HTML keyword. That is to say, they are part of the HTML language. So it is not you just typing anything. They are actually part of the HTML language. However, under certain special circumstances, you can add your own attribute. We will look at such circumstances when we are treating HTML properties. For now, this is the structure of an HTML attribute. Now let's move on to look at some attributes in HTML. The star attribute. I purposely wanted to start with this attribute because of the window it will lead us into. Now, the star attribute is a special decoration that we give to an element to affect its appearance and sometimes behaviors. That is to say, a star attribute enhances the element with appearance and behavior effect. Okay, so with that understanding, let's move to our IDE to see how the star attribute is demonstrated and the effect it has on the element. Okay, so we're going to apply the star attribute to our divisions, our div element. From our previous lesson, we added these div elements. We are going to style them now. So straight away, we start the first div by introducing the attribute star. And then, as we said, the value must come in between the double quote. However, the star attribute is also a special concept in HTML, which has the value to also be more of a different topic on its own. So we're going to say this div, we want the width colon 100 px, that's pixels. I know by now you should know what is a pixel. You use smartphones and you have tablet. The pixel is the picture element an image can have, the picture element, so pixel. So the higher the pixel, the bigger the element. All right, so we are giving it 100 pixels, and then we're going to give it a height of also 100 pixels. As you notice, after the width colon 100 pixels or px, there is a semicolon. This is to tell the HTML that I am done with the first part. Let's call that the first statement or the first sentence. The next one is also another statement, another star statement. So let's say star attribute has statement separated by semicolon, and each statement is a key value pair connected by a colon. A bit confusing, but observe. Now the spacing within, is negligible. Nobody minds it. You can either bring it or leave it. I'm going to remove all spacing. Or better still, I put spacing in between statements. Yeah, so you can see what we're doing clearly. Okay, here, so I'm giving this div a styling of width 100 pixels, of height 100 pixels. I'm going to give it a background color of red or blue. Yes, blue. But what am I typing with height, background color? Yes, they are special styling keywords. We need to know them. They are special styling keywords. We need to know them. So you're not just going to type anything. They are predefined special styling keywords. We need to know them. Is that okay? All right. So now we have given this date a height, a width, a background color. Let's go and see in our browser what we have so far. Okay, we did it in the index page. So we double click to open that. Okay, so from our browser, we can see that the space, the div parent of space A and B have the background of blue, and it has a width and a height. And this is what the 100 pixel can do. This is what the 100 pixel can do. Now we can see that we are now adding some beautification to our website. We are adding some beautification to our website. So therefore, styling attribute actually introduces what we call CSS to HTML. CSS to HTML. If you remember, CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheet. So we are moving the content of the style sheet and bringing it to the HTML. So we are using the style attribute. Are we good? All right. Okay, so this is what we have so far. Now we want to add another trick to the children div. The children div. We are going to style that one to those ones too as well. So star attributes, and then I'm going to give some spacing around it so that it doesn't hit the walls of its parent. So we say spacing around an object is called margin, colon, giving a margin of 20 pixels. Pay attention here. We are entering a new window. We are entering a new field altogether. It might be confusing, but pay attention. Margin is also another styling keyword that says that give some spacing around me. Give some spacing around me. Let's consider that you have a house, that you have walled that house. Now, the margin of the house is the space around the house before somebody else's house. Or let's say the space in front of the house before the main street is the margin of the house. The space between your wall and the street is the margin of the house. So the space outside the object is the margin of that object. Are we okay? Okay, so what if the spacing inside the object? How can the spacing be inside the object? Now, let's consider the house again with the wall. The wall is the border or the boundary of your house. The space outside is the margin. Now, the space within the house from the wall to the building itself is what we will call padding. Let's give a padding of 30 pixels. Margin padding is all for spacing. Margin is a space outside the boundaries of the object so that the next object does not hit your boundary. So in actual sense, you are trying to create some security space around your object so that the next object does not hit you. We don't want friction. So margin gives space around you. Now inside you, you want some spacing within before the actual content of the object. So we give padding. So for example, this div, we have a margin of 20 pixels, meaning that there will be 20 pixels outside it, a padding of 30 pixels, meaning that from its border to its content, there will be another 30 spacing in there. Here, the content is the keyword space A. So between the border and then the place where space A will print, there should be a spacing there. That spacing is the margin. Ha ha ha, it's getting interesting. This is what we call styling an HTML document. There are a lot of keywords in styling we will learn very soon. Now let's see once again what we have so far. Okay, so this is where we left. I'm going to refresh it. I said you can click this to refresh or you press F5 on your keyboard. Very good. Now we can see that after adding the margin to space A, space B has moved far down. I mean, space AB has moved far down. So therefore, space A has some spacing around it. Spacing around it. Now you can also see that the word space A has also moved somewhere in, meaning that there's spacing inside the div. Now, because I constrain the div to a length or to a width and height, the word in it is suffering. So I'm going to increase the width and the height to see what would happen. Okay, so we're going to increase the width to, let's say, 300 and the height to 250. Now we go back. Hey, all this while I don't seem to be saving my work. Please, I have installed an autosave. Under File, there is autosave. You can click to check it so that whilst you type, it saves automatically for you. Under File, you have autosave. Check it so that whilst you type, it saves automatically for you. All right, so we've increased the width and the height. Let's see what we got now. Okay, a refresh. Very good. Now, after increasing the width and the height, this is what we have. This is what we have. Okay, so it's push space AB down. Now, you see space A has come in there because we haven't given that styling. So let's quickly move in, add some styling to space AB and styling to space B as well, and we will have something so beautiful. Okay, so we're going to repeat the same thing for space B. Let's remove the line break here. Let's give space A and space B some width as well. A width of 150 pixel, and then a height of auto. Now let's do the same thing for our space B. Now we're going to remove the line break here as well. Now we're going to give same styling to space AB, and then we will change the color to red. Okay, so let's go and see what we have so far. Refresh. Voila. Okay, so let me explain here. Now you realize the first div had two children, space A and space B, and the div itself has no margin around it, but we gave margin and padding to the div A and div B, div A and div B. And then div AB, we just gave a background color and a width and a height, and we have this beautiful design. Now, space AB is having its content printed to the wall because there is no padding. There is no padding. A space within your borders is padding, and a space outside your borders is margin. This is the styling attribute. Okay, so the styling attribute helps us to style our HTML element, and it has so many keywords that we can make good use of. That it is for now. We will come back for it as a full topic. Okay, so that is how the style attribute is applied on an element, and of course it changes the look and feel of that element. Hope you enjoyed that session. That actually introduced us into the new language CSS, that is cascading style sheet. That is a full topic on its own. We will treat one day. For now, let's proceed to know a little more about HTML attribute. Okay, so building on the previous lesson, now we introducing something we call ID, name, and class. An attribute called ID, an attribute called name, and attribute called class. Now, within a single HTML document, we can have a whole lot of elements in there. From our just ended coding exercise, we realize we have about 3 divs, 4 divs over there, 2 divs, and within one of the 2, there are other 2 divs. Now, we need to identify these divs so that sometimes along our code, we can handle them properly. We need, or is advisable, or is appropriate to identify them so that we can handle them properly. Therefore, we introduce the ID attribute. The ID attribute. Also, we can use the name attribute to identify elements. However, the difference here is that the ID attribute must be unique per page. That is, there should be always at most just one element with that attribute value. What I mean here is that when you give an attribute ID to an element, let's say ID equals main or ID equals Joe. Now that value within that ID attribute must not be repeated on that same page. In same manner, name attribute must not also repeat. However, there are certain circumstances you would like to name a group of elements with the same value. On the other side, or on the other hand, The class attribute is also used for identifying elements. However, it is used for identifying a group of elements. So if you want to apply a certain styling to a group of elements, then you identify all of them with the same class value. It's a bit confusing. I think when we move to the IDE to see what we're talking about, it will be much better. So let's move ahead. Okay, so this time around, I'm going to work on the session and the H1 to H6. Now, the first thing we're going to do is to apply the attribute ID. So we call this one main session. All right, you can do it this way. You can also do it this way. You can also do it this way. Pick a standard and stick to it. I'm using the hyphen as my standard. Now, what I mean by ID attribute is that we are using this ID attribute to identify this element section. And the value in there, which is main section, should be unique on this page. That is to say, if I have another session, I cannot name that session main session because there's already a main session. If you do that, the browser will only pick the first one and ignore the subsequent one. So I can name this one sub session, and that is cool. That is about the ID attribute for identifying element. Now, let's move on to the class attribute. When we want a group of elements to behave the same way, or if we want to style a group of elements the same way, then we can give them a class. So I will say blue color. And I can give this class to as many attributes, as many elements as I can. And whatever blue class will mean, it will affect all of them. Whatever blue class will mean, it will affect all of them. Just like the ID attribute, name attribute also goes the same way. However, mostly name attributes are used on form. Input forms. So I'm going to introduce one input form element where we can give it a name. Inputs name nickname. It is a special element. It doesn't have a content. And I can have another attribute called type. The type is to get a nickname, so it's a text. Yeah. Now, this is an input element to make room for a user to type in something. Very soon, I will move to the browser. Now, this is an input element. It's normally used for receiving input from our users. That is, it gives fields for users to type in some text. So, an input element can be given the attribute name. Name attribute, just like ID attribute, must be unique. So let me call this first name. However, there are certain instances that name attribute will behave like a class attribute. When we move to form element, we will see an example of that. Okay, so what are we doing now? what we are doing is we are just identifying them. So in actual sense, there's no effects happening here. We are just identifying them so that it will help ourselves as developers. It's not going to do anything to the HTML. It will help ourselves as developers to be able to identify them and apply certain things to them. Now, when we move to CSS or external styling, you understand this. Let me briefly add something small on that. Now, you see, with the div, we style it directly here. So there was no need for identify it. Suppose we move the styling from here to here. You remember I said you can style here. Now what we need to do is to call the element we want to style by its ID or by its class. Now I move them from here. I'm going to give it an ID of upper div, and then I'll call that ID in this star with hash upper div and open a curly bracket and put my styling in there. Hey. Ho ho! Trouble is coming. Trouble is coming. Okay, what are we doing? We are trying to remove the attribute from the div because we can have a whole lot of styling element attached to it. That will make our work very clumsy. So why don't we just identify it and move all the styling somewhere so that it will apply to it as it has been identified. The same work. Okay. Now, as you can see, space A and space B have the same styling. So your guess may be right. We give them the same class name and then apply the styling to it. So I'm going to give them a class of inner div. And that same class will also be applied to the space B. And then the style attributes, which is the same, will be extracted from here. Let me remove it. I wouldn't need it here again. Okay, I've cut it. So when I get here, now I'll introduce the name of the class. And class is identified by dots. And it is inner div. And open a curly bracket and I paste the content in. What is the curly bracket doing? Yes, that is software programming. Now to group a block of code that applies to the same thing, that performs the same function, we use the curly bracket to group them. To group a block, a number of codes that perform the same function, that applies the same concept, we use the curly bracket. So this is called a block of code. A block of code. All right. So now we have an ID for our upper div. We have a class for our inner divs. Now we're going to call this our lower div, which is an ID and must be unique. So lower div. And then we cut the styling from here. What did I do? Undo. Okay, so I need to cut just the styling and then remove the attribute placeholder from here. Now I go to the style and call the ID by introducing the hash and the name of the ID, and then lower div. Open a curly bracket and paste my block of code in there. Voila. Okay. All right, so this is getting interesting. We are identifying the elements on the page, and then somewhere we are trying to call them and apply certain things to them. Now, this is what we've done. Let's see the effect we will have on our browser. Okay, so before I refresh the page, let's see. This is what the styling attributes did before we left for our identifying attribute. Now let's refresh and see, after introducing the identification, what has happened. Refresh, nothing happening. Refresh, nothing happening. Yes, nothing happening because we just changed the location of the styling. We didn't change anything. Now let's go back to the code and you see what is happening. You see, initially we had the styling on the element. We had the styling on the element. We had the styling on the element. However, now we have just labeled or identified the element with an ID and then extracted the styling into the style element in the head. And then we call the ID, open a curly bracket, and we paste the contents of the styling in there. And it does the same job. It does the same job. The class also does the same job. Now, class can be applied to multiple elements on the same page. That is why we have class this here, class that here. But IDs must be unique. Okay, so this lesson is getting a bit confusing, but take your time, go through the process, and we will soon have our way. Okay, so that is it for ID, name, and class attributes, the identifying attributes for our element. As you saw from the coding session, we added an ID, we added a class, and we added a name. And then we saw how the ID and the class can affect our element externally. That was an awesome exercise. That was an awesome exercise. Okay, so let's move on to find out more about other attributes. Okay, I think these attributes have already been discussed. The href attributes on the anchor and the src attributes on the image or script. Let's go and then have a look at them once more. We wouldn't waste my time here because we've already looked at these attributes in previous lessons. Okay, so when we introduced the link element, we spoke about the href attributes, which help us to locate the resource we are connecting to this page. That is the work of this attribute. And then when we introduce the anchor, it is the same resource locator we introduce as an attribute. However, when we were talking about script and images, we introduced the src attribute. We introduced the src attribute. href and src are all linking to external document. However, you should know where to use which of them. You should know where to use which of them. Anchor and link is href, whereas image and script is src. Okay, so these are attributes that we have already used them in our previous lesson, so I wouldn't waste my time here. Let's proceed to the next lesson. Okay, so that is how far we have come. At this moment, we will go for a short break. When we come back, we will look at the HTML DOM. I mean, what happens when the browser is loading all these elements with its attributes and its values and the CSS? What happens in the browser? I mean, not as we see it, but behind the scenes in the browser, how is everything being loaded? We will look at that after the break.